I'm saying there is no such possible determinant. The universe we have is the universe we have to have.
What a great turnout. Wow. I'm Thomas Fink. I'm the director of the London Institute for Mathematical Sciences. We're Britain's first independent physics and mathematics research institute. And we're delighted to have Stephen Wolfram here. It's the first time we've met. Stephen's come from America, even though he's English. I grew up in America, and now this is my home. In fact, when I was growing up in Texas, there were two scientists who had a big influence on me. The first was Roger Penrose, who I read as a young teenager, who got me excited about physics. And the second influence, when I was an undergraduate at Caltech, was Stephen Wolfram, who got me excited about research. In particular, his work on cellular automata. And my first paper that I published as an undergrad was a cellular automata model of pattern formation in geomorphology. So it's great to have you here. Stephen is a physicist, a computer scientist, an AI developer, a mathematician, a science communicator, and a tech founder. By the time he left Oxford as a teenager, he'd published 10 papers in theoretical physics. He moved to Caltech, where he did his PhD, I think by age 20, was the youngest recipient of a MacArthur Genius Award, and joined the faculty of Caltech. And it was around this time that Stephen started to develop some of the ideas for what's now become Mathematica. Most of you will know Mathematica is what we all use to do symbolic manipulation and deal with equations, and has since become a vast programming language. A few years later, he moved to the Institute for Advanced Study, and it was around that time, I think, that Stephen started to really get excited about the complex behavior that's generated by simple rules. Today, Stephen is the founder of Wolfram Research, which is the company behind Mathematica, WolframAlpha, Wolfram Language, and as well the more recent physics project and meta mathematics project. He's a pioneer in at least a dozen areas of science and technology. So it's great to be able to interview him. We're going to interview him for an hour, then we'll have question and answers for about 30 to 40 minutes. I'm joined here by Ananyo Bhattacharya, who is our chief science writer. Ananyo was an editor at Nature, then he was science writer at The Economist. Most recently wrote the definitive biography of John von Neumann. So let's get started. Ananyo.
Stephen, welcome to the London Institute for Mathematical Sciences. We're Britain's only independent theoretical physics institute. And whilst we are proud to be housed in Faraday's old rooms here, we are independent from the Royal Institution. So there is sometimes some confusion, but we are independent from the RI. Stephen, we have been obsessing about all of your oeuvre, listening to podcasts and so on. And what struck me as von Neumann's biographer, or his latest biographer, was your passion really for the history of science. You seem extremely interested in it. So I want to sort of ask you, how do you think the history of science should or does play into contemporary discovery?
You know, when I think I figured out something new and different, one of the things I try to make sure of is that I know what I'm talking about by seeing why did people think it was different before. So for example, recently I was working on the second law of thermodynamics. I got interested in the second law of thermodynamics when I was 12 years old, sort of trying to figure out how it works ever since. I think I finally figured it out. And I'm like, why had people not figured this out before? So I decided I better go back and actually understand the full history of the second law of thermodynamics, going back to the 1820s and so on. Having gone through that history, I now know why did people not see the things that I now think are kind of obvious in all that time. So that's, for me, it's kind of grounding, you know, how do I know that what I'm doing now makes sense? You know, a lot of things I've done in physics recently have kind of broken away from ideas that people have had for a long time. Like, for example, one of them is the question of, is space discrete or continuous? People have been wondering about that since antiquity. I mean, back in antiquity. There was Democritus with atomism. There was Heraclitus with everything flows. It wasn't clear until the end of the 19th century whether anything was discrete or continuous. Then, end of the 19th century, probably right in this building, things being discovered about the molecular structure of matter. What I had not known until recently was in the early 20th century, most of the famous physicists would have said, yes, space is discrete too. And they tried really pretty hard to make discrete models of space. They couldn't make it consistent with relativity. And so by the 1930s, they'd given up. There's very little literature about this because they gave up. They didn't write about it. Finally, we figured out, for me in the 1990s and then about 5 or 6 years ago, how it can be that space is discrete, and that unlocks all kinds of different things. But knowing that history is pretty important for me, and sort of feeling like, I might know what I'm talking about because it's like that was what people were doing 100 years ago. They just got stuck.
So I got the feeling when I was researching that book, The Man from the Future, and when I talked to physicists, that not many of them really felt the same way. I mean, you get this sort of rather cliched view of sort of Einstein sitting alone in his patent office, suddenly discovering relativity with no, run up to it. Lorentz, who's Lorentz? Who's Poincaré? That sort of thing.
But
Do you think this is a problem?
That the patent office was the Silicon Valley of its time. I mean, the Bern patent office was like going to work in a Silicon Valley company. So it wasn't quite the being thrown out into the outer darkness.
Yes, absolutely. But do you think that that's a problem for contemporary physics, say, or maths, that people seem much less aware of their roots and maybe don't take history?
Look, what happens?
What could the problem
look,
be?
I think the point is when you get a field of science, there's typically some methodological advance. Then there's 5 or 10 years, maybe 20. Where there's low-hanging fruit to be picked, lots of things get discovered. There's a very rapid growth period, and then things slow down. And for 100 years, it's sort of slow growth. The thing is very institutionalized. There's sort of a force against new ideas and so on. I mean, I think that the concept that that one should have that there are these places where new things can happen. And that's they typically are outside of the kind of whole institutional structure of things that are going on. I mean, it's always in any, I've been lucky enough to be involved in a number of sort of fields that were new at the time when I was working on them. And, the rate of growth in new fields is just so much greater than it is in sort of well-developed institutionalized fields.
So, seeing as we're on the topic of history and influences, could you give us when you were young and starting out in particle physics and so on, what are a couple of scientists that influenced you or inspired you at the time?
The problem with these things is always, eventually you actually meet the people and you discover that they're not as, I think I was more collectively inspired by the fact that in the 1970s, when I was kind of excited about particle physics, just things were happening every week. I mean, it's kind of like machine learning today. There's kind of, there's progress every week. And that was encouraging. I mean, I got to know sort of most of the kind of the greats of particle physics at that time. I mean, I would say, Dick Feynman was one person I got to know pretty well. He was, I would say that I agree with him about some things, not about other things, but he had he was somebody who really was very keen on sort of probing to the essence of things, which is something that I like very much as well. I mean, I kind of feel like that's the way that you make progress, is by actually understanding the foundations of things. You had asked about sort of the development of fields and what people look at. I think one of the things I've noticed is, there are people who found a field, and they always are a little bit unsure whether the foundations are really right, and they're perfectly happy to explore the foundations. Then you go, 5 academic generations later. By that time, the people who are working on the field are like, foundations? We know the foundations are correct. They were established, 50 years ago or something. We don't need to look at the foundations. And insofar as I've made progress in a bunch of things, it's often by going back and attacking the foundations again, because nobody looked at them in 50 years or 100 years.
Can I mention a foundation which I think needs attacking? And I'm thinking of self-replicating machines that learn, so life. but I prefer not to use the word biology because I like to keep it more general. But you first wrote to us, or wrote to me when we had done this this list of 23 mathematical challenges, which is out there in the hall, which we did because ARI was getting founded. It's the sort of Britain's first version of DARPA. And it's a number of those things are about, about life. How does it work? A thermodynamic sort of model of life. Physics seems to say nothing about life. If you put, speaking of foundations, mutation, inheritance, and selection in a box and shake, nothing neat happens. Or at least I claim. I certainly haven't seen stuff that you'd write home about. So what's going on? Why is life, the foundations of life, so sort of, thin?
It so happens the last few weeks I have been working on exactly this.
So good timing.
And I sometime probably in a couple of weeks I'll finally post the things I've been working on, but I'll tell you about them. So I mean the one way of thinking about the problem is to ask the question. We have a living system. Back in the days of Faraday and so on, one would have said we're made of protoplasm. What the heck is protoplasm? Are we made of liquid, for example? Just what is liquid? Liquid is a bunch of molecules randomly bouncing around. Occasionally they react and so on. They're probably not really liquid because we know from molecular biology that there are all these active transport processes that are moving molecules and carefully organizing, how these big molecules line up and so on. So really what we are is some kind of bulk orchestrated collection of molecules. Can we have a theory of bulk orchestration? That's the question. We have a theory of statistical physics where we say if you put enough gas molecules in a box, their chances are the second law of thermodynamics will take over, the configuration of molecules will be able to model as being roughly random, and we can make all kinds of conclusions like the gas laws and fluid dynamics and so on from that. But in this case where instead of it being just randomly bouncing around, it's all orchestrated. Can we make a theory of bulk orchestration? So I've been thinking about this for a few years. I finally made a little bit of a breakthrough a few weeks ago. So here's roughly how this goes. And I haven't talked about this before, so this is maybe a bit rough. But okay, so it starts from something that I figured out last year that I had tried to figure out in the 1980s and failed to figure out. So these cellular automaton systems that got mentioned that John von Neumann studied and so on, they're very simple rules. They're just this array of cells, and there's just a rule that says the color of this cell is determined by the colors of the cells on the line above it, let's say. And the big surprise is that even though the rules can be simple, the behavior of the system can be really complicated. Okay, so I knew that back in the 80s. Then I thought, let me use this as a model of biology. Let me say, I've got these rules, but like they're genomic rules, they're like the genome, and then the behavior of the system, what the cellular automaton does is like the phenotype. Let me try and mutate the rules and see what I can do to the phenotype. I tried doing that in the 80s, it didn't work. Well, I came back to this last year with one new piece of intuition. The new piece of intuition was machine learning and the fact that machine learning works. And the surprise from 2011 or so that, if you bash a neural net hard enough, it will learn, which wasn't obvious to anybody. I mean, that wasn't, the fact that worked was a big surprise. So I thought, let's just try bashing the system a bit harder and see whether it can evolve. And it does. And so what you find happening is, I was just, the simplest sort of fitness function that I was using was have a pattern that lives as long as possible, but not an infinite time. And what you find out is it discovers these very elaborate forms. It'll make some discovery about, if you have this runner that goes this way and then that way, then you can live a bit longer. And then it will build on that discovery. Roll the dice for the mutations of the genome again, it'll make a different discovery and it'll build on things in a different way. And it's rather wonderfully like the fossil record. It discovers how you can make, claws or something, and then it makes a more and more elaborate claw to do things. So that was kind of the thing I realized last year is that you get, what is biology doing? It's using sort of this ability of computation to make complicated things, and it is doing that in a way that's adapted to these fitness functions. And the thing that one of the things that I find kind of fun and shocking is that you get these very elaborate patterns, these solutions to these problems that you'd never as a human ever guess. They're not anything you'd ever engineer. They're things that are just discovered as these features of sort of irreducible computation that just happens to work. one thing I tried doing recently was feeding some of these patterns into an LLM and say, write a description of this. It writes a description. It says, it makes up these names for these different little structures and so on. You read it, it reads just like a biology textbook. It's kind of, it really is, it's kind of like in biology, we're being thrown this kind of, example of this, random computation that happens to work. I think, by the way, that's very similar to the way that machine learning works, but that's a different story. Anyway, to this question about sort of what is sort of biological matter? What is that? What I realized is, what you see is you have some fitness function, like live as long as possible, and so on. You get these solutions to how you achieve that fitness. Okay, then what I thought about is the following thing. Could it be the case that I should explain one more thing. There's a question of why does biological evolution work? In other words, why is it possible to successfully, adapt to be fitter and fitter and so on? And the answer, I think, is a little bit of a few steps. Maybe I won't go through all the steps, but basically the point is, okay, actually I should go back and say something else first, which is why does the second law of thermodynamics work? I mentioned that I worked on that recently. And okay, there's this observation that very simple rules can produce very complicated behavior. One of the sort of consequences of that is a phenomenon I call computational irreducibility. So you might think if you have the rules for something, then you're done. You know everything about how the system will behave. And in some sense you do, because you can just run the rules and see what happens. But the question is, you might have to run the rules for 1 billion steps. The question is, can you jump ahead and say, oh, I know what's going to happen, I've just got a formula for the answer, right? The claim is that in general, you can't do that with computational systems. In general, they are computationally irreducible. The only way you can know what's going to happen is to run them and see what happens, okay? So that's a fundamental phenomenon that sort of leads to this kind of apparent complexity that we see all over the place and so on. Okay, second law of thermodynamics. The idea is you've got this initial condition that might be quite simple. The molecules bounce around in the box. You can, in principle, always reverse the configuration you get and get back to what you had originally. But in practice, you aren't able to do that. I think the reason you're not able to do that is because you, as an observer of this, are computationally weak compared to the irreducible computation that happened in the actual mechanics of the system.
You mean we couldn't figure out the complex configuration which reversed backwards in time would lead to the ordered special configuration?
Yeah, we're seeing one of these configurations, and it is not obvious to us that, it came from something simple, because we'd have to run all that computation to figure it out. It's because of computational irreducibility we can't do that. So in a sense, the second law is a consequence of the fact that we are computationally sort of limited observers relative to the computational power of this dynamics underneath. It's sort of interesting coming back to, I'm reminded again by being in this room, of the 1860s, okay, when the second law of thermodynamics was young, and people like Kelvin were going around saying, it will lead to the heat death of the universe. After a while, the whole universe will run down and we'll just have, will just be random heat. Everything will be. So what's wrong with that picture? The point is that for an observer like us today, it looks like, things will randomize but yet that future of all the molecules that are us today that will be something different in the future. If we were more sophisticated observers of that future, we would know, those molecules, a trillion years in the future are the result of this conversation that happened in 2025 or whatever else. Right. It's just that because we are, as computationally bounded observers, we just say, it's just random heat. And that's so that, there's only a heat death of the universe for observers like us. There's only the second law of thermodynamics for observers like us. It turns out this interplay between computational irreducibility underneath and the computational weakness of observers like us, it turns out one of the big exciting things that I think I figured out in the last few years is that's where the laws of physics come from. That's both general relativity and quantum mechanics and the second law of thermodynamics are all consequences of that interplay. One of the surprises of a few months ago was realizing that biological evolution is the same story. That is, if you have all these possible mutations that are happening, and you're asking, well, which mutations are a good idea? Well, there's some fitness function that defines which ones are a good idea. if that fitness function was incredibly computationally sophisticated, it would pick out some weird branch here. But it's because it is a computationally weak fitness function that biological evolution can work. So to give an example, let's say that every organism, when born, had to be able to do calculus. Basically, you wouldn't get any organisms to survive because it's too difficult a thing. It's too fine-grained a thing to have to be able to get the organism to do. But because all it has to do is, hang out and make more organisms and so on, that's a coarse enough thing that it's possible that the underlying computational irreducibility of the development of organisms is sufficiently powerful that that kind of weak objective is achievable.
What about artificial life? I mean, has that been a failure? Or, I mean, are we seeing things in artificial life? I mean, I know this has been going on for a long time now. Since
I don't think that's I mean, well, just to finish this thought about, so the reason biological evolution works is because the fitness function defined by the environment is computationally simple compared to the underlying mechanics of what an organism can do. Okay, so then the question is, well, what can we say about the underlying stuff that the organism is doing? And what I realized is there are many different fitness functions you can define, but if you know just one thing about them, that they are computationally simple, that tells you something about what underlying rules are the ones that would be the successors when adaptively evolved to satisfy some computationally simple fitness function. So the notion in traditional statistical mechanics, these ideas of ensembles, the set of all possible configurations of a system, and you say, well, the behavior we see is typical of all possible configurations of a system. So I have this thing I'm calling the rulal ensemble, which is the set of rules which are consistent with having been evolved for a computationally simple purpose. And so the claim is that biology is kind of, you can think of a theory of biology not by knowing all the details of what all the particular mechanisms of the spliceosome or whatever else are, but just by knowing this one fact, that they were evolved for a computationally simple purpose. And that fact then sort of pushes its way back into the actual microscopic dynamics of what's going on. And so you start to discover all kinds of things, I'm calling it mechanoidal behavior, behavior where there appears to be small-scale mechanism in what's happening. And there's a certain inevitability to that.
So let me sort of pull you back to those experiments that you've been doing sort of recently. And this was presumably with your sort of one-dimensional cellular automata, were you?
Happens to be, yeah.
Yeah.
I've tried it with two-dimensional and Turing machines and things like that as well. It doesn't make any difference.
And we're really interested in AI-assisted discovery here. You met Professor Yang just as we were coming in. He does AI-assisted discovery in maths and theoretical physics. And Yevgeny, who you've also met, he explores AI-assisted discovery of integrable models. So you've been in on this really since day one, right? Can you give us a little potted history and briefly of how you?
Well, I mean, I think of myself as having lived the AI dream for the last 40 years. Okay, what is the AI dream? The AI dream, as I see it, is I have a thing that I want to do. Let me get it done as automatically as possible. So I'd been building tools to get it to the point where both tools and I would say management structures like companies and things like that, that make it as efficient as possible to go from I have an idea about what to do to that thing can actually be implemented. And so, the tools I built are not neural nets. They're, the main tool I built is Wolfram language. And the main idea there is to have a way to kind of have a notation for thinking about the world computationally. Just like, mathematical notation from 500 years ago kind of made it sort of streamlined to talk about mathematical kinds of things. Our goal is to sort of have it be streamlined to talk about computational kinds of things. And that's been, for me, the most powerful methodology is just using that stack of tools and kind of looking out into the computational universe and just sort of searching through trillions of programs, let's say, and seeing, what's out there. And it's very surprising what's out there. Now, it's very different, what's out there revealed by the raw computational universe is very surprising, very non-human, very kind of against our intuition. Neural nets and that kind of tradition is a little bit different because, what the LLMs are doing, so to speak, is grinding up kind of human knowledge in a first approximation. I mean, there's more that you can train them on than that, but in a first approximation, it's kind of grind up human knowledge and then feed us back this kind of humanized version of things. So for example, if you're trying to discover mathematical theorems, I've studied quite a bit the question of what is the long time limit of mathematics. In the literature of mathematics, there are 3 or 4 million theorems that, that have been written down. What will happen when we have 1 trillion theorems or 1 quadrillion theorems? What's the continuum limit of mathematics when we work out all the theorems? And there's quite a lot you can say about that structure. But the question is, when you start just sort of, enumerating possible theorems, most of the theorems you enumerate are ones which are perfectly valid theorems. They're just ones where a typical human would just shrug their shoulder. It's like, why do we care? What matters is which of those theorems are ones that humans care about. And that's the thing which I think the current generation of LLMs and so on, I haven't managed to make this work. But in principle, one can imagine that that's a place where that can be useful, is to say, well, there's all these things you can find that are out there sort of abstractly, but which things might we humans actually care about?
So is that the role of the human mathematician? Do you still see a role for a human mathematician? Because, whenever you go out on social media these days, you probably don't, which is quite smart. But should you ever happen to go out, young mathematicians are extremely worried that maths is going to come to an end because AI will
I think
replace
that there's this question of what is mathematics foundationally, okay? And so, the view that came about, end of the 19th century, right, was math is this formal thing that is derivable mechanically. Hilbert had this idea, we just write down the axioms of mathematics, then we grind out with this machine, we work out all the true theorems of mathematics. Gödel's theorem kind of blew that up. But the fact is, the fact that Gödel's theorem blew that up and the fact that most working mathematicians don't care about Gödel's theorem tells one something. In other words, this level of mathematics, of just at the level of the axioms, grinding one step in front of the next, is not what mathematicians typically do. There's an analogy, actually, with something we just talked about, which is thermodynamics. In thermodynamics, there's this molecular dynamics level where there are all these molecules bouncing around, and we could say, in order to know how a gas is going to behave, we have to go look at how every molecule behaves. That is one possibility. But the fact is, we know we don't have to do that. We know we can do fluid mechanics at the level of just talking about, velocity fields and things like this, not what does every individual molecule do. The question is, what is mathematics really doing? Is mathematics something that is operating at this axiomatic level, or is mathematics, as humans do it, something that is operating at this more fluid dynamics type level? And I think one thing that's interesting is that higher level mathematics is possible. It might not be. Fluid mechanics might not be possible. It might be the case that the only way you can know what a fluid is going to do is to go down, drop down, and work out what every molecule does. And in fact, high-level fluid mechanics is possible. And the same thing is true in our models of physics. The same thing is true of the structure of space-time and so on. In mathematics, the fact that high-level mathematics is possible is another one of these phenomena. Mm-hmm. So for example, if you take the Pythagorean theorem, typical proof-assistant system, if you want to establish the Pythagorean theorem on the basis of axioms, like axioms of set theory, you'll get this thing with 7,000 lemmas or something. Big, complicated mess, right? But the fact is, nobody cares. They just want to talk about the Pythagorean theorem. By the way, there are many different collections of 7,000 lemmas or whatever that differently prove the Pythagorean theorem. But mathematicians, as they normally practice mathematics, are operating at this kind of humanized fluid dynamics level, not at this kind of axiomatic level. And I think, I will say that, automated theorem proving was kind of a previous iteration of kind of the let's discover mathematics automatically. I believe it's the case that a thing I discovered 25 years ago remains the single example of a result found in mathematics by automated theorem proving that was not already believed to be true. So I found this, I was interested in what's the simplest axiom system for Boolean algebra. So people had, for about 50 years, people had tried to sort of grind down what's the simplest thing, and X or Y is the same as Y or X, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What's the simplest set of what's the simplest basis for Boolean algebra? So I had this guess there might be a pretty simple one, so I just started searching for it, and I found this little tiny thing that's a single axiom with 6 NAND operations in it that gives Boolean algebra. And I found that by using automated theorem proving. And I actually just earlier this year, I tried again with AI to understand that proof. I completely failed, as everybody else has.
But you got this through enumeration, complete enumeration of all the...
I found the proposed theorem by enumeration. I then proved it by automated theorem proving.
Okay,
the proof is about 120 lemmas long, and it's incomprehensible.
Right.
I mean, I tried, I made quite a serious effort with sort of the finest AI tools and maybe a little bit of cleverness to decode what on earth is going on in this proof. And it's just like, it's just, you can verify the steps. It's easy to verify the steps, but it's incomprehensible what this is. There's no waypoint. It's not like it's not like it gets to a theorem and you say, oh, well, that was something that Gauss proved or something like that. It's out in this alien world of sort of meta-mathematical space.
Sorry, I'm not following. So what does that tell us about the role of human mathematicians then? Is this, are we...
Well, I think the human mathematics is more of an artistic endeavor, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, mathematics is what you choose to do and what you do it at a humanized level, so to speak. And when you talk about proofs, is this proof that, the automated, that find equational proof in Wolfram language made 25 years ago for this thing, is that actually a useful proof? It's not a proof that explains why it's true to me as a human. It's a proof that validates that it is true. And maybe I can build on that fact, but it's not a proof that is an exposition of anything. And I think, in terms of there's an infinite, meta-mathematical space is very infinite. And there are many different directions you can go in mathematical space, many different kinds of theorems you could prove, many fields of mathematics you could invent. The question of which ones you choose to invent is a very human thing. Right. It's like asking for human language. We have 50,000 words in typical languages. We've invented certain words because we find those useful for the kinds of things that we tend to think about. You could imagine inventing millions of other words. And in effect, AIs have done that internally. Millions of sort of effectively words for things. But we with our sort of human civilization, we populate certain parts of this sort of concept space. And, a lot of, if you start generating, like, here's a fun experiment. You use a generative AI system, image system, and you say, make a picture of a cat. Yeah, it'll do that. Then you say, let me change the numbers in the embedding space to make something that isn't quite a cat. It's a little bit away from a cat. There's a cat island where the pictures more or less look like cats. Away from Cat Island, you're out in what I call interconcept space. In the space where there are pictures, and you can look at them, but they're not things for which we have words. They're not things where we have filled in a human concept. And it's actually a bit humbling that even with a very simple generative AI system, the fraction of the space that is interconcept space is absolutely overwhelming. It's like, there's only one part in 10 to the 600 or something that is things that we've given names to. And it's the same thing in mathematics. There's a vast interconcept space of things that we humans have never decided to care about. And that's that's something that is, it is a human choice what direction we go in, just as it is for inventing words in human languages. And you might ask, I noticed you had shown me a piece that you wrote about how physics informs what mathematics does.
You had some views on this.
Well, I do, yes. Yeah. Because there's the question of what, first thing to understand is what is science, okay? The natural world does what it does. It's doing all these computations and so on. We, on the other hand, have minds that can do a tiny fraction of the computation that the whole natural world can do. So the way I view science, what is science? I view it as being this kind of bridge between what actually happens in the world and the narrative that we can understand with our minds. So science is this way of extracting from the natural world just that small thread of narrative that actually fits in the human mind. And so, when you ask, well, what, is what fits in the human mind, there's certain kinds of things that we can talk about because they sort of fit, they're things that fit in our minds. Insofar as mathematics is a vehicle for doing that, that is more a statement of the kinds of things that we have, the kinds of things we have so far built up ways to think about, so to speak. In other words, physics, as physics is not intrinsically mathematical. I mean, insofar as we think we actually know what the machine code of physics is like now, we can say this is what the machine code is like. There's a lot above that machine code. There's kind of lots of different specific sort of Okay, so from this machine code, there's sort of this irreducible computation that's actually happening in the universe. We take little slices of that irreducible computation, little reducible slices that we can understand. So when
What's a reducible,
okay,
like computationally reducible pocket?
Yes, yes. So I mean, the idea is, yeah, right. So I mean, whenever you have one of these computationally irreducible processes, sort of to know in detail what's going to happen everywhere is something that takes this irreducible amount of computational work. But within any computationally irreducible system, it's actually inevitable that there have to be pockets of computational reducibility, places where you can actually say something. In fact, there have to be an infinite number of these.
You mean, so the primes, there's no like efficient way to get the primes, but we might be able to say something about the primes,
yeah,
and
exactly.
That's an irreducible pocket.
Right, that's a reducible pocket. And the fact that there are an infinite number of reducible pockets is why we'll never run out of inventions. We can always, in the physical world, we'll always find little things where we can make progress. In mathematics, we'll never run out of sort of theorems we can establish and so on. Sort of places where we can make progress.
So how does that relate? So I should explain that a few months ago, I wrote an article on why physics and physical intuition seems to lead to really interesting mathematics. So the other question, the flip side of that, was discussed for decades. Why is math so good at giving us physics, at describing physics, at being the language of physics? And that's been discussed to death. But I sort of flipped that on its head, and that issue has been discussed too within at least some scientific circles, but I hadn't seen it discussed in the sort of wider media. So are you saying that it's something to do with our physical intuition that's a little bit more, that gives rise to mathematical problems we find interesting? Or,
right, I mean, so first question is, the world does what it does. We only perceive certain aspects of it.
Right.
That's the first thing. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on, whether it's little quantum fluctuations in this or that we just throw up our hands and say it looks random to us. But there are things where we can make statements. Like, Newton was really lucky that he studied rigid body mechanics, that he studied, that he wasn't doing, for example, fluid mechanics. If instead of trying to make laws of mechanics with, solid objects moving around, he tried to make laws of fluid mechanics that have included fluid turbulence and things like that, he would not have come up with any simple kind of reducible statements about how the world works. But he ended up with this slice of the world that was one about which one can make fairly simple sort of narrative statements.
Right.
And I think that's in a sense why, mathematics, okay, insofar as mathematics captures a certain piece of reducibility, the mathematics that we do captures a certain sort of piece of reducibility. That's something we can use to understand slices of what happens in the world. It's not the whole of what happens in the world. It's the part of what happens in the world that we're capable of understanding and that we therefore use to build technology, for example. Because when we build technology, most of the time, at least until modern times, we've ended, well, actually,
Can I? Speaking of Newton, can I jump in?
Yes. I want to say one thing about technology, which is that it's sort of a fun fact that post-industrial revolution, people expected to understand technology. They expected they could see the cogs, see how it worked, and so on. Before that time, you got a donkey. The donkey did what you wanted it to do. You didn't really ask how the donkey worked inside. We're now back to more of that situation, so to speak. And so we've been there before, but anyway, please.
So I was writing a grant app in the summer for AI-assisted discovery to the UK government. And one of the things, and this is before we knew we were going to meet Stephen, one of the things we wrote is, it's funny how the way we discover physics and mathematics is very similar to the way Newton did it. It's paper and pencil. And we maybe two things to change that. One is computation, easily accessible computation. It gives us more data. And the other is symbolic manipulation, so Mathematica. But maybe each of those doubled our rate of scientific discovery. But it seems, and indeed, when you look at how scientific discovery is done in practice, it's largely done by universities. One of the things that we're interested in this organization is, how can we speed up discovery? I mean, if you look at athletes over the last 75 years, have basically gone from amateur to professional. I mean, they're sort of pushing the boundaries of human achievement. you have seen multiple, or I feel you've investigated multiple ways of thinking about how to do discovery, both from the academic point of view, from the tech leadership, tech entrepreneur point of view, and I think you bounce back and forth between pure science and technology. If you were to create a discovery machine, what would it look like now?
Yeah, I mean, look, I've been sort of lucky, or it's actually been planned, that I've kind of alternated between doing technology development and doing basic science. That's been a very useful loop because, the basic science shows you what you can do in technology. The technology builds you tools that let you do basic science. But I have to say, in terms of discovery, for me, the absolutely dominant effect in how much discovery happens is strategy. What is it you're trying to discover? What are the questions you're asking? Much more than the mechanics of how to do it. Now, I happen to spend a lot of time trying to optimize the mechanics of how to do it. And I feel like we've gotten a long way with that. Now the question, and this is a thing that often goes wrong, for example, at universities. They are unmanaged organizations. You're a professor there, nobody ever tells you what to do. If they do, you get very upset.
Right.
But the fact is, people, spend decades they kind of redoing what they did in their thesis, but it doesn't really work out very well, and so on. And I remember years ago I used to consult at Bell Labs, which had a somewhat better, more kind of, they had a sense of purpose that was kind of, it was not that heavy-handed, at least the parts I saw weren't. But nevertheless, there was some sort of flow of what are we trying to achieve. So I think that there are aspects of how do you make significant, you have to. The strategy of the questions you ask is, I think, one of the most important things, which is why I liked your list of questions, because I thought they were pretty good. And I think, but I think somehow, I was mentioning before that this thing about, foundations of fields. People usually avoid working on the foundations of fields because they say, oh, that was established 100 years ago. There's nothing to do there. The fact is, if you can make progress on the foundations of a field, this is incredibly high leverage. I mean, that's and often you can make progress, not least because nobody looked at it for so long. And the methods that exist now are really different from the methods that existed before. So, but, in terms of the things like the institutional structure of science, I mean, one of the things that, science, one should be careful what one wishes for in science, because you have a field, it's small, it's young, it's entrepreneurial, lots of things are happening. And then it's successful. And then it gets big, and you build these giant institutional structures, and then it's very hard for new things to happen because people say, oh, that doesn't follow the lines that we were thinking about, that can't get funded, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's complicated. I mean, and I've wondered, certainly, about sort of basic science and how should one do basic science and how should one pay for basic science and why should one pay for basic science and so on. I mean, I've been fortunate that the theoretical science that I do is not that expensive, and I've just been using resources from my tech life to support that. Now we have a separate Wolfram Institute, which has a few more resources. But it's this question. I mean, there's always the question of why should society support basic science? That's a fundamental question, and I would say that I've noticed that whenever some entity has a monopoly on how basic science gets used, then it justifies supporting it. So, for example, Bell Labs in its day, lots of kinds of innovations. Bell Labs is going to be the main beneficiary. The U.S. government, as the biggest economy, there are lots of kinds of things which, if progress is made, the U.S. government is going to benefit. It's much. I know in our small corner of the world, in various kinds of mathematical computation, we do basic research because we pretty much know we have the distribution channel for making use of that. It's a rational thing to invest in pure basic research in those areas. But it's more generally, it's much less clear to me, at least, how one makes this work. I mean, talking of Newton, one of the sort of thought experiments that I found fun is if you're old Isaac back in 1687, you've invented calculus, you're sure that trillions of dollars of value is going to come from calculus in the next few hundred years. What can you do? Do you create, calculus coin or something to try and do something to speed up that value? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I mean,
so Thomas, you had views on exactly this issue, right? How to sort of make science pay, how to make it more efficient.
Well, I mean, I think you know, the question of why do basic science, I think is an important one, and I think it's not clear. I think there are weaknesses in the current model of how, you know, sort of, well, let me put it this way: there aren't many variations in how science gets done. If you want to create a really good restaurant, or, you know, you probably want a lot of different restaurants who are quite independent. You have many different kitchens and styles. But the way science is done today, whether it's the IAS or, you know, the, you know, UCL, is strangely homogeneous, and I feel that lack of variation isn't great.
I mean, I do it in a somewhat different way. So I mean, you know, first of all, I don't do it for a living, which helps the psychology of doing it. Because for me, you know, it's like I discovered something about mathematics. That's great. I didn't need to discover something about mathematics. And it's much easier to, you know, you have to realize in doing science, you have to have some prejudice about how things are going to turn out. Otherwise, you never even explore that thing. But the trick is to not be so invested in that prejudice that you don't realize the chips are falling somewhere else and they weren't, you know, agreeing with that prejudice. It's been really interesting to me because I've really honed this kind of psychology of just let the chips fall where they fall. And rather often, they've ended up being more to my prejudice in the end than they appeared to. You know, at the beginning, it was like, this is not the way I thought it was going to be. But in fact, it ends up being much more the way I thought it was going to be, but in a way that I didn't imagine. But I think, you know, I mean, this whole question of what, you know, my own way of doing science has been sort of, I've been fortunate that I can do it without doing it for a living, so to speak. I've done a number of things that I think are pretty nice. One thing is live streaming a lot of stuff. You know, most science, you never get to see it done. Particularly in the early days of our physics project, we were live streaming a lot of our internal discussions, and it was right in the middle of the pandemic. So I have to say it surprised me that we would get like 5,000 people watching some incredibly technical, you know, discussion about mathematical physics. And perhaps that was purely a pandemic phenomenon, but it was still kind of interesting. That's one thing. Another thing that I've been very big on is sort of computational reproducibility of everything. So, you know, I write a lot of stuff. I mean, I will say, I haven't written a paper for an academic journal since 1986. So I'm out of that business. But, you know, I write a lot of stuff, and I'm happy to say, you know, a decent piece of mine, 100,000 people will read it and so on, which is very good compared to your typical academic, you know, journal article. Right. And one of the things I try to make sure of is when there are pictures, and I, you know, make very elaborate pictures, you can click the picture, you'll get Wolfram language code, you can run that code, and you'll reproduce that picture. That turns out to be really powerful, because like we do, you know, okay, so in addition to all this research stuff, we've also done some innovations in, you know, attempted some innovations in education. So, you know, we do this summer school every year. We've been doing it for 23 years now. And, you know, what we find is people make use of, you know, they click the picture, they get the code, they build on that, they do something, you know, that they sort of zero out the effort that it would have taken to make this whole elaborate visualization that they probably wouldn't bother to make. So, you know, those are important. I mean, the fact that there still aren't sort of forced computationally reproducible journals is kind of shocking to me. Right. I mean, it's you know, the model of journals long predates, you know, Faraday's time and so on. It's the late 1600s, except the late 1600s journals were much more like blog posts. I mean, if you read those things, they read a lot more like the kind of stuff I write than what you find in typical academic journals.
So I actually wanted to pick up on that as we rush onwards towards the audience Q&A, which is this science communication point that you made. You know, you said you were live streaming some of these experiments and so on. Now, when I was researching The Man from the Future, I read a bunch of the sort of 1910, 1905, 1920 quantum mechanics papers, and I found that you could follow them. Wow, even with, you know, an undergraduate degree in physics, I was able to follow them. I couldn't do that now. And it seems to me that, yes, of course, technically physics has exploded and maybe it's more difficult, but I think that there's almost an active effort to make physics and maths less understandable. I mean, how do you feel about this?
Well, you know, I was amused. Literally yesterday, I was in some math library, looking at some book about cellular automata, actually, and I look up some stuff that I invented, and I couldn't understand it in this book. So, that maybe tells one something. No, but I mean, it is a lot more effort to say things in a way that people can understand. I mean, like with my New Kind of Science book, it took me a decade to write that book. And part of that time was grinding these ideas down to the point where they were actually clean enough that you could explain them without a lot of technical sort of, apparatus. The technical apparatus usually doesn't really help. It's usually, I think it's often just sort of a smokescreen, and it takes effort. You have to dig through it, and then you say, well, that's the actual idea. I mean, it really helps when there's computational language code, because the code, whatever may be said, whatever arm waving may be happening in the text, if there's code there, it either runs or it doesn't. And that really helps to ground these things. But I think in my own view is that exposition is an integral part of doing good science. In other words, if you really want to do science, if you really want to understand it, you have to be able to explain it. And I found I've had this weird hobby that I started at the beginning of the pandemic of doing a live stream Q&A a couple of times a week, typically. I started it as a science and technology Q&A for kids and others, where I was just sort of answering kind of general science questions, because I figured all these kids were out of school at the beginning of the pandemic. But I found it sufficiently fun and sufficiently educational for me that I've kept on doing it. I do find that the one thing that happens is whenever there's a question, which I think I know the answer to that question since I was 12 years old, those are the ones that always trip me up.
So how do you get so much stuff done? I mean, do you work 40 hours a day?
Everybody wants to know the answer to this one, I think.
I've become reasonable. Look, it helps that I run a company that is, I think, a pretty efficient company with a lot of very talented people. And that's a high magnifier of getting stuff done. I mean, it also probably helps that I built tools that, automate a lot of things. And it's like, yes, doing this stuff about this rule ensemble for Foundations of Biology, I get a certain, I don't know, it's a strange feeling, because I'll do something where I have some idea, type in some lines of code, things happen. In an hour, I've done something which I know perfectly well. In the typical sort of rhythm of academia, this would be a year-long project. And, that happens because I have tools, I have some degree of strategic sort of thinking about how one puts things together. And it also helps that I'm usually, this exposition thing is important, because it's kind of if I was just doing this stuff in a vacuum, it would be different. It really helps to ground it in the fact that I'm explaining it to someone. I mean, I have silly, obsessive kinds of things that I do to try and organize myself and, keep data on what I'm doing and things like this. But really, it's mostly that I've just built a bunch of tools, including, a company and now an institute that is an attempt to sort of amplify what I can personally get done.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. Before we go to the audience, I'm going to do something a little bit mean, and I hope you take it in the spirit in which it is meant. So we've only covered a small fraction of the work that you've ranged across and your activities. So we're going to ask you some big questions, but only give you till the turn of this.
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm going to be just terrible at this. I'll see what I can do.
Yeah. Well, we shall see. There'll be 10 questions.
All right, okay. Let's see how I can do.
Shall I turn it?
Will you turn it?
Yeah,
all right. So there's a minute and a half approximately for each of these. Right. Stephen Wolfram.
Yes.
What's wrong with science today?
It's too big. There's too many people doing it, which causes it to be too institutionalized and make it too difficult for innovative things to really happen.
How do you fix it? I mean, this is the same question. It's all right. Take your time.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I think that, the places where it gets fixed are where there are these puffs of newness that come from new methodologies and so on. And I think that's, how you best support that is a really interesting question. I mean, what you guys are doing is an interesting, idea for how to do that. What we're trying to do is actually somewhat similar kind of idea for how to do that. How that works in the ecosystem of the world, I don't yet know.
So next one.
Hey, I really managed to do
You're
that.
doing brilliantly.
Okay.
So here's a really trivial one. Is there a God?
That's an interesting question. So, one of the things that's come out of our physics project is this is really going to be challenging. Okay. Okay. When I was a kid, I'm gonna use up time on this. Yeah. When I was a kid, I grew up in England where there's a state religion and so on, and was always objecting to all those kinds of things. And I remember this question of, are there souls? And I was like, if the soul is a real thing, it must have a mass. What's the mass of a soul? Of course, that's the wrong question, because now that we understand computation better, we realize that there is a notion of what's in minds that isn't a physical thing that has a mass. So I'm suitably humbled by that observation. Okay, so in our physics project, one of the big questions is sort of, why did we get this universe and not another one? So what I realized is this idea of the Roolead, the entangled limit of all possible computations. And it turns out that it seems that sort of the Roolead, which is sort of all possible computation, this abstractly defined thing, is in some sense sort of everything that can be, and observers like us inevitably perceive the Roolead in the ways that we see physics to be. Okay, so how does this relate to God? Yes. Okay, so one of the questions is, why does the universe exist? Does there have to be something outside the universe that makes it exist? This whole idea of the Roolead makes the existence of the universe something necessary. What it doesn't make necessary is our existence. And that's actually quite related to all these questions about biology. I'm almost going to make it. I think this question of whether there needs to be something sort of beyond the universe that is the cause of the universe, I've now started to understand that there's a way to see why the universe has to exist as a necessary thing, that there are observers like us within the universe is less necessary. That is something which, to establish that it is possible for there to be observers like us, is a sort of science question. And we ran out of time.
And we did run out. Maybe we could circle back to, is there a God, later. Oh yes, so do we have free will?
Okay. So that I've thought about quite a bit. So this phenomenon of computational irreducibility, I think, is the thing that sort of cuts the knot about how free will works. In computational irreducibility, there is a deterministic underlying rule, but yet to know what will happen is something you can't do without just letting the thing run and seeing what it does. So for us not to have free will, the defining feature of us not having free will would be, you can look from outside us and you can say, I know what he's going to say next. That would be, I know what that moth is going to do, banging on the window to go to the light. It doesn't have free will, so to speak. Free will, in some sense, operationally is you can't predict what the thing is going to do. Its will is not obviously determined by these underlying rules. And that's the story of computational irreducibility. So I think
the answers are yes.
What?
Do we have free will?
Well, in the sense that you can't predict what we're going to do by some more efficient method than just watching us do it.
Yeah.
But to ask whether from outside us, so to speak, if you had a computationally arbitrarily sophisticated thing, could you predict what will happen? Then I think the answer is yes. But so it's a slightly subtle.
It depends
point.
what you mean by free will. I
Yes.
guess. Right. Number 4.
I think these things run longer than I think.
Yeah, it's a lot of time, isn't it? Are we in the midst of an AI market bubble? Just to change things up completely.
The answer is obviously yes. Okay, I mean, AI is certainly a useful thing. It is it's like this, discovered wild animal. We just discovered horses or something, and now we can, now we're building, horse-drawn carriages and things like that. A lot of the value is going to come in the horse-drawn carriages rather than the horses as such, I think. I think that, it's complicated when markets get this sort of bubbled up, that often opens up possibilities to backfill with things that are then quite valuable. Right. Even if the thing itself that was originally invested in wasn't, was just the flag that caused people to come there and put lots of money in.
Right, like the dot-com bubble. Before.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's yeah.
Right. Okay. How far on the AI bubble? How far away is artificial general intelligence?
And are you afraid of it?
And are you afraid of it?
Okay,
I was going to give them
that's a
another
bonus,
question on that one. It's a bonus question.
No, I mean, I think it's sort of a meaningless thing, because you say, well, what does it really mean? Well, it means something that's intelligent like a human. And you say, well, over the course of time that I've been doing things in computation and sort of AI-like areas, there have been lots of times where people have said, when the AIs can do X, Y, Z, like do symbolic integrals, let's say, then we'll know they're intelligent. Pretty soon they can do symbolic integrals and everybody says it's just engineering, which it is. And, so that's been a repeated thing. And the time when you really say it does just like what we do, but it's a machine, is, everything that we do is something only done by us. You basically have to make a full replica of the human, so to speak, to get sort of the everything. So I don't think it really, I think it's a concept that doesn't really make a lot of sense. And I think that's. Am I afraid of it? No, because I don't think it's a concept that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think that, it's going to be interesting because, people think about, extraterrestrial intelligence. And I'm always like, well, the weather has a mind of its own. In my view of how computation works, the weather is doing all sorts of computation, not that different from the computation in our brains. Just doesn't happen to be aligned with the way that we think about things. My guess is people will come to terms with the fact that sort of the natural world is full of intelligence about the same time as they sort of come to terms with the fact that sort of there's these different forms of intelligence in different places. They are more or less aligned with the way we humans operate.
Yes, I was going to ask you, what's the most intelligent species on Earth? Is it the squid or the dolphin?
Oh, I think it's the weather for sure.
It's the weather. So yeah, we actually had a historian of science in last week, Tom Haig, and he said, yeah, artificial intelligence, it's a ridiculous name for a field. It's because it's a long-term ambition. You don't name fields after long-term ambition. It'd be like calling economics universal prosperity and universal health, So it's that was struck. Right, we're running out of questions. We've got a couple more. So one for the nerds. What will Mathematica look like in 2030?
Well, what's interesting is, you build more things and then you understand more, more of what's possible. I mean, in other words, we've been progressively building things and progressively understanding sort of new ways that we can make new frameworks, new kinds of things we can unify and so on. And that's been a progressive thing. And I would say that there are, I had a to-do list back in 1991. We finally finished that a couple of years ago. There's a long to-do list of things, and many of them are conceptual things where really the big challenge is the design of the language, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I partly because I'm not the one who's in the trenches implementing it, so it looks like that part has its complexity as well. But for me, it's kind of like, how can, language design is like this way of forcing you, it's like a form of exposition. It forces you to understand with great clarity how things work. And I'm steadily understanding more and more about kind of how different things get put together. I could talk about lots of different things that we're trying to do, but I would say we started it in 1986, so 2030 is not far away.
Yeah.
It will be lots of things that we're trying to figure out right now, hopefully will have been figured out by then. And lots of I would say that in general, in a lot of things I do, about half of what I do is stuff that I've been thinking about for decades, and half of it is things that are sort of opportunistically made possible by things that happen in the world.
Is there some big thing? I know we've run out of time on the thing, but I'm just going to ignore that briefly. Is there some big thing in Mathematica that you're working towards?
Well, there are a number of things. I mean, here's one thing, which is back in the 1600s, people had these things they called philosophical languages, which were an attempt to sort of capture everyday discourse in a way that was sort of formalized. That's what Leibniz, for example, worked on that a bunch. So people sort of didn't do that for a few hundred years. We're trying to do that again, and I think we're going to succeed. And it's sort of interesting because it is it's a way of formalizing another level of what happens in the world. And we've been able to formalize a lot of things that have come out of things like science. This is a way of formalizing something that comes out of kind of everyday discourse. So that's an example of a big project.
Right. Okay, so here's my last one. Alexander Grothendieck or John von Neumann? Pick one.
For what purpose? To meet?
Interpret it how you like. As an influence, as somebody you're drawn to.
I mean,
that's the
John
infinite
von Neumann.
What's that? I was thinking of the groupoid thing.
Yes. No, I mean, I know much more about John von Neumann than I know about Alexander Grothendieck. So I would say that, I always have thought of von Neumann as somebody who asked a lot of very interesting questions, sometimes did not choose to go as deep as he might have done. Asked the right questions, didn't dive deep and really find the foundational thing. Grothendieck, sort of perhaps the opposite of diving deep and asking the deepest questions, but not always clear why those questions were being asked. I mean, one of the things, the infinity groupoid, which I never thought I would ever find any use for, is actually something closely related to this Rulliard object that I mentioned. So it's, but I would say that, if one could take all the things that von Neumann worked on and say, that's a good question, now let's answer it in a foundational way.
Right. I
mean, I think that would be, like quantum mechanics, for example, his formulation of quantum mechanics, I think is that has led people down very much down the wrong path in, for example, quantum computing, because people, in the von Neumann formulation of quantum mechanics, it's like, and then you do a measurement, boom, it just happens. That isn't really how things work in the physical world. Measurement is actually a process. And, the fact that when you imagine in a quantum computer, there are all these threads of computation that happen, but to know what the answer is, you have to knit those threads of computation together. But von Neumann told us it's just a measurement operator. So nobody's taken, people have not tended to take that apart and say, just how much effort is it to knit together those threads of quantum computation to work out what was the answer? So I think that's a place where he sort of led people a bit in the wrong direction. But anyway.
Wow. Well, we can talk about that one later.
Yeah. I'm sure.
So the answer, I think, was Alexander von Neumann, right? Or,
yes.
So we're going to turn to questions. So who wants to go for Min-Young, sorry.
My name is Min-Young Kim. I'm a mathematician. I'm the director of the International Center for Mathematical Sciences. I hope it's okay to ask two questions. The first one is easy, I think. When you said in the early 20th century, a lot of physicists thought that space was discrete, who do you have in mind? Do you have a collection of names? Who are they?
I mean, Einstein, for example. Einstein,
he's written about this?
Yeah. And there's a letter from 1916, people have pointed out to me many times, actually, in which he said, in the end, it will turn out space is discrete, but we do not yet have the tools to see how that works.
Oh, I see. So it's not that he had a theory. I mean, he said this.
Well, other people had theories. So, for example, Heisenberg had an actual theory, and he had this sort of egg crate theory of space-time, sort of a lattice theory, and he couldn't make it work. 1930 comes along, and he's like, I'm just going to think about what comes into a particle interaction, what goes out. That was the S matrix. That was the invention of the S matrix. And he did that because he got so fed up with trying to figure out what happened inside and how to think about space. He just said, let's not even think about what happens inside. Let's just think about the initial state and the final state. Okay. That's another one was Bohr. Also, I learned recently, also had a discrete theory of space. And actually, here's a funny story. So Chandrasekhar apparently had in his, this is a multi-level story that Chandrasekhar carried around with him a little card that Bohr had written for him at some dinner or something that contained essentially commutation relations for the structure of space. So a quantization of space. And the person who told me this said that Chandrasekhar had told him that he carried this card around as a reminder that even the most brilliant scientists could do things that were completely wrong, like think that space was discrete, so to speak. So it's a whole collection. I mean, I'm hoping one day to write a history of this. It's a little bit hard to dig out because these things there are letters, but there aren't published papers because they just didn't make progress. And it's...
Sorry, if I could sneak in one more question. This is actually a question for both of you to some extent about exposition. The comments you made about exposition and things being too technical. To be honest, I don't know a single mathematician or physicist who doesn't complain that some other paper is too technical. They all complain, right? So if you listen to them carefully, everyone seems to think people should be just as technical as them.
Right.
How do you escape this trap?
I think there's I try really hard to write things that I think anybody who puts enough effort in could understand.
Obviously, but a lot of people would find it impossibly technical, right?
Things I write, I don't know. I mean, look, I'll tell you a story from when New Kind of Science came out. Talking to a well-known mathematical physicist, okay, who was complaining about, actually, basically just said, I look at this book and I can't understand anything. It's just a bunch of pictures and code. I was like, well, that's kind of what a new paradigm looks like. It has a new way of explaining what's going on. But yeah, I mean, maybe you're right. I mean, to me, if it's a piece of code that I can run, then it feels like something that I can understand. Whereas if it's a piece of elaborate higher category theory or something, maybe it doesn't feel like a thing that one I more or less understand these days. But it's more difficult to understand.
No. Do you have an answer?
Well, it's Stephen that's being interviewed, but I suppose I don't really have an answer to that question. But I would say that what I find in certain fields, not mentioning any maths, where there is, from certain practitioners, a certain pride in being opaque to appeal to their community. And I find that to be a sort of hubris that is actually not useful.
I don't think that's true myself.
You don't, or you do?
No, I don't think people. I don't think people make it deliberately opaque.
I think it's easier to write very technical stuff.
Yes,
often.
yes, I agree.
That may be true, but I don't think they're
takes a lot
trying
more
to be
work
opaque.
to make it. Should we take a next question?
Hi, Dmitry Kostik, Ukrainian mathematician. First part of your conversation triggered my memory to backdate to the school and university when I compete in different Olympics on the math and physics. And the question, it's a two-part of the question. One of the personal and another the source of the knowledge. So basically, back days, a lot of my success in the competition was triggered by what I can describe as intuition. So most of the time I predict something and I then took like another hour to explain to myself why then, and it's in many things it's become to the same conclusion. I mean, and then I spent some, I don't know, like researches to explain why and how it's happening. So the question, is it something that is you're facing for all of your life in the work and the different tech and the research project in terms of the intuition? And the second, maybe you can point me to some source of the case study works or other people who maybe describe this from their life experience. Thank you.
I mean, intuition is sort of one of the most important things in terms of, what do you choose to study? Well, you have to have a guess about how it's going to come out. The thing that is for me, I view what I do as being sort of this strange mixture between sort of philosophical thinking and raw computation, so to speak. In other words, I have some general intuitive idea about what's going on and some way of putting those ideas together in a sort of logically, philosophically constructed fashion. But then I have sort of the grounding of it. Then I do the computer experiment. Often the computer experiment violates some aspect of the intuition that I had, but I need that sort of framework, that intellectual framework, and then I'm grounded in sort of the computer experiments. And that, for me, has been a very useful way to do things. I mean, I know, we mentioned Dick Feynman earlier, who was, a really good calculator, really good human calculator. Like he would, work out, he would, start at one end of a blackboard, go calculate, and he'd get the right answer at the end of it. I found that absolutely incomprehensible. I mean, then I would show him computer calculations, and he would say, "I don't understand how you could possibly know whether this is right." But it's what I think, yes, you need intuition as a guide, and the best way to get intuition is to just see a lot of things. I mean, intuition about what happens in the computational universe, I'm surprised all the time. But nevertheless, I do have 45 years of intuition that I built up about how things work there. One of the things that I've learned, I say to people who work with me, my line is usually, the computational animals are always smarter than we are. So, we think we know what's going to happen, and we do the experiment, and it never quite works the way we expect. And that, that's happened to me within the last week. I've had that experience. So, it's not like it's a thing that happened in the distant past and doesn't keep happening.
Sure. Only one-part questions allowed hereafter.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. My name is Tore Greipel. I work as an AI researcher at DeepMind. So you invoked this idea twice that a weak computational process interacts with a strong computational process. In your experiments on evolution, where the objective function is simple and the computational process of life is complex, and also when you talked about science. Is this maybe the most interesting corner of the universe for us to think about cases in which a simple computational process interacts with a complex one?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's partly because that's related to what our minds are like. We take in huge amounts of data from the world, we compress it down to a small sequence of, what actions are we going to take. We are pulling out this, we are a quintessential example of, as you're putting it, a weak computational process interacting with the world. I would say that in, more in the area of machine learning, for example, that's, I think, what basically is happening in machine learning. That is, the way I view it, if you think about what is machine learning really doing, and the way I see it is, let's say your objective is to build a wall. Well, you could build a wall by making bricks that are very precise. You arrange the bricks in a very engineering kind of way. Or you could say, I'm going to find these rocks that are lying around on the ground, and they're all these weird different shapes, and I can more or less fit them together to build this wall. I think that second thing is what machine learning is doing. It's the fact that the rocks exist, these lumps of computation exist, that make it possible to build up those capabilities. But if you insisted that that LLM did this very precise thing that is, it wouldn't work. You wouldn't be able to build that. It's the same story as with biological evolution. It's the fact that the complexity of what's happening inside the LLM is far greater, sort of the computational force of what's happening inside is far greater than the things we're asking it to do that makes it possible to have it work, I think. I mean, I have to say, I think these foundational questions about why machine learning works are really interesting, deserve to be studied a bunch more, and I don't think have been studied nearly enough.
Great, thanks.
Juven?
Juven Wang. I'm a research scientist at the London Institute for Mathematical Sciences, abbreviated LIMS. So the question is related to Richard Feynman, and this question has been answered by Feynman, is that if there's any single message that we want to preserve as a scientific knowledge for the next future generation, if all the civilization are destroyed and we need to rebuild from ground zero, so what will be the message that you would like to convey? And just recall, Feynman gave the answer, said that it's more like an atomic hypothesis, that all things are made by atoms in some way. And in modern terms, atoms in this answer is more like some kind of a cutoff. Within below certain scale, smaller than that atom scale, we have just purely been ignorant about anything. But that's kind of reductionism. However, there's also the laws between the atoms that we need to know their interaction. So out of that, their emergence come up. So in some sense, his answer actually combines some kind of reductionism to some scale. There's a cutoff, and then built out of there's an emergence out of the basic rules. In some sense, he probably also can include some renormalization, group concept, etc. But I wonder whether your discovery, like a few weeks ago, do you provide a new answer into this? If you want to fit your answer into one single piece of paper, how would you leave your message?
Well, I think in terms of the reconstruction of science as we've discovered it now, it's kind of interesting to look back at the history, because one of the anomalies of history is that computation, universal computation, was not discovered really until the 1920s, 1930s. It could have been discovered in the 1600s, I think, but it wasn't. In other words, that was something where you had to know that that was an idea that was worth having, and then you could build a lot of things on that basis. And I would say if there was one thing that it's like, this is an idea that's possible, that would be a thing worth communicating, so to speak, because then you can build a lot from that. It clearly wasn't obvious in history, yet you didn't, if you'd gone back and told Leibniz universal computation is possible, he would have understood that, I think, and he would have built a whole bunch on that basis. It's just he didn't have the idea. So that would be a good thing, a good spark to give to the future civilization. Right. And actually building computers, well, there's a very big pile of technology you need to do that. It would take a long time to reconstruct that. If we're back to the Stone Age, I think it's going to take a while to get back to computers.
Yeah, maybe Babbage would have got his funding after all.
Right.
Yeah,
right. No, I think the ultimate irony with that is that I happen to have studied, Ada Lovelace and Babbage, and there's some amusing things to say about that. Yeah. I'm sure they must have lived near here, Ada and Babbage. They must have lived within a mile or two of here. I know that when they were in London, they were exchanging, there were 14 mail deliveries per day. So you could actually see letters go back and forth.
You wrote a long chapter on Ada and Babbage.
Ada, yes.
Did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'm sure. It's Hannah Devlin. I'm from the Guardian newspaper, so not a mathematician. I was interested in your description of science as being basically a narrative that we can fit inside our minds and sort of having this very human view of what the scientific endeavour is. And I'm interested in, we're living through this kind of AI revolution where increasingly we're going to see sort of science shaped by what AI is able to do, and then some of that is going to be, some of what we get from that is going to be mediated through AI as well. And it's not just a question around science, but basically I'm interested in what you think of the idea that the world is kind of maybe going to be increasingly things being done by AIs for AIs rather than for humans, and whether you think that that's a problem in science. You seem quite relaxed about, kind of AGI and, what that means. But I'm interested in, is there a negative side of that? Are we going to be less able to kind of contribute to science as humans?
Well, look, I mean, the thing is, even right now, there's sort of a society of AIs that exists. There are probably more AIs in the world in some definition of, counting AIs than there are humans in the world. And those AIs are interacting with each other, and they're, doing all kinds of things. They're buying and selling ads and all kinds of other things that AIs like to do, so to speak, or end up doing. That there is a whole, there's a whole civilization of AIs that already exists, much of which is actually pretty hard for us to understand. And you might say that's a shocking situation for us to be in. How could we be living in a world where there's all this stuff going on that we don't understand? But actually, we're very familiar with that, because the natural world is another example of something where you can think of it as doing lots of computation. The weather or lots of other kinds of things are, in effect, doing lots of computation that we don't understand, but we have found ways to coexist with that. So I kind of think that the idea that we should understand our technology is a very industrial revolution kind of idea. It's an idea that we should not expect that we will understand everything about how the systems we're dealing with work. Whether we can, it's kind of like the horse analogy. You could use a horse as a way to get transported, and you could say, I'm not satisfied with using this horse. I need to understand how the horse works. That's a different, but you don't actually need that to make use of the horse, so to speak. But with respect to science, there is a question of if you can say, how is this particular process going to work out? We can, branch number one, we can use this scientific model where we can see how the innards of the model work, and we can answer the question. Branch number two, we use a black box AI, and we just sort of say, based on your training data, what's going to happen? That second thing can be technologically very useful. It is not going to give us, science in the same sense that we've thought about science in the past. To have a this is what's going to happen black box answer is not what we have traditionally thought of as science. it's something that can be useful in technology, but science tends to be the thing where we are understanding a narrative about some aspect of how the world works, I think.
You don't think we're being disempowered by AI then?
As I've said, I feel I've been living the AI dream for the last 40-something years because I've steadily been able to do more and more because more and more is automated. And I think, the choice of what to do, it's like if I switch on my computer and say, okay, what would you like to do? It doesn't, that's not a thing that makes much sense. It's, the definition of which direction you go is something that, we humans, it's our choice what to do. I mean, because there's sort of an infinite set of possibilities, it's, you have to pick some of those possibilities, and that's something for the time being that we get to do. I mean, at some point, it's like the natural world. It doesn't give us, the natural world just does what it does. Similarly, kind of the civilization of the AIs just does what it does. We have to, find the right way to coexist with that. This is it, yeah.
Here's the mic. Do you have the microphone?
Front.
I think it's coming your way.
Pass it down to the front. Thank you.
Hello, my name's David Ambrose. I'm a complete imposter in this company because I'm not a scientist, I'm a fiction writer, sometimes science fiction. It just struck me that in the course of your talk, you haven't mentioned two words in particular, consciousness and mind. Does this mean you actually don't believe there is such a thing as the hard question of consciousness? I mean, as you know, Penrose has long argued that it is not simply a matter of computation. He's basing his argument on Gödel, and he has various suggestions what it might be, which are still basically, I suppose you could call materialistic. In other words, these what do you call them? Those sort of mini connections between
Microtubules.
Microtubules, sorry. So, can I also, in asking that question, bring up the fact that I've always been struck by a number of physicists who've made extraordinarily spiritualistic claims, starting with Max Planck, who said quite clearly, many times, he firmly believed that mind was behind everything, that in fact matter was a product of mind. You have people like James Jeans, who said in the 30s, the closer you look at the universe, the less it resembles a great machine, the more it resembles a great thought. Eddington said something similar. They're beginning to sound like medieval philosophers saying,
well, I think I have various points
in the mind of God.
Right. I mean, I have various thoughts about this. I mean, one point is that one of the surprises to me has been that I think the laws of physics are the way they are because we are the way we are. That is, that in this idea of the Rulliad, this limit of all possible computations, there's a question of how do observers like us perceive that unique, inevitable object that is the Rulliad. And the laws of physics that we have are because we are the way we are. So to give you a very basic example, the idea of space, which seems pretty obvious to us. But, I look around this room, I can see maybe 10 meters away. Light comes to me in, a fraction of a microsecond from 10 meters away. It takes my brain many milliseconds to process that signal. So for me, as I look around the room, it's like it's very reasonable to think of the room as having a certain state across all of space at successive moments of time. If my brain thought 1,000,000 times faster than it does, that picture wouldn't make a lot of sense. I would be seeing the individual photons arriving and saying, oh, I can think of this as being the state of space at successive moments of time. That's it's a feature of the way we are, that we perceive physics to have the structure that we perceive it to have. So in some sense, I view it as being the case that the laws of physics that we have depend greatly on the way that we are as observers of that physics. So in that sense, I think we are a lot more central to kind of it's not the case that there's a physics that just exists and we are merely the recipients of that physics that exists. What exists in general is this whole Rulliad, and the slice that we perceive because we have the methods of perception that we have. So that's now in terms of consciousness, I have to say, the idea that there's sort of something magic that goes beyond physics that leads to sort of conscious behavior, I kind of think that LLMs kind of put the final nail in that coffin, because I kind of think that there were all these things where it's like, oh, maybe it can't do this, but actually it does, and it's just an artificial neural net. I think also with respect to a lot of the importance, I think our notion of consciousness is a lot related to the fact that we believe in the single thread of experience that we have. It's not obvious that we should have a persistent thread of experience. In our models of physics, we're made of different atoms of space at every successive moment of time. So the fact that we have this belief that we are somehow persistent, we have this thread of experience that extends through time, is not obvious. It's something that just happens to be the case. And I think, well, I was recently thinking about the following question, which is, our brains have maybe 100 billion neurons in them. And one of the things that's notable is that all those 100 billion neurons could be doing different things, but yet we concentrate things down to have a single thread of experience. But then I was wondering, if we had 100 trillion neurons, what qualitatively different things would we think about the world? At 100 billion neurons, we can do things like invent compositional language. Cats and dogs don't do that, so far as we know. And what would we get to if we had sort of higher levels of higher brain power, so to speak? And I got to thinking about this thing that we do of taking all the sensory data that we have and concentrating it down to decide very slowly what the next action we should take is. How did that, which I think is a key feature of our version of consciousness, how did that even come to be? And I kind of realized that probably when animals first existed in sort of the history of life on Earth, that's when we started needing brains. If you're a thing that doesn't have to move around, the different parts of you can be doing different kinds of things. If you're an animal, then one thing you have to do is decide, are you going to go left or are you going to go right? There's sort of, there's a single decision you have to make. And I kind of think it's a little disappointing to feel that this whole vaunted thing that ends up being what we think of as consciousness might have originated in just that very simple need to decide if you are an animal that can move. You take all that sensory input and you have to decide, make a definitive decision about, do you go this way or that way? It's kind of disappointing to think that all of this might come from something as mundane.
Can I ask a very short supplementary?
Yeah.
I very much agree with you on that, by the way. It's the way I tend to think. But are you one of the mathematicians who thinks that mathematics, as Penrose thinks, is a Platonic reality out there, or is it a language created by mathematicians?
This is something about which I've written rather a lot. It's a complicated story. I think that it is, this Rulliad object is kind of the thing that is all possible mathematics is. And it exists. The question of what, so it is a thing out there, and its existence, the Rulliad, as this entangled limit of all possible computations, is something that is both our physical universe and mathematics. So whether we perceive it as physics or as mathematics depends on how we are observing it. There is a single object that is sort of one slice of it is physics and another slice of it is mathematics. And I think insofar as we believe that the physical universe exists, we have to believe that there's in some sense, the mathematical universe also exists. So it's kind of a definitively Platonic thing to say. On the other hand, the way that we choose to parse that Rulliad, that all possible mathematics is something that is very human and very kind of, we can construct it in a variety of different ways. This is a long story. I wrote a whole book about this.
Last question.
I have a short question.
They never are.
You earlier described mathematics as an artistic endeavour. What did you mean?
It's something where you can choose to do this or that. It's not that there is for example, let's say, we have certain axioms that we choose to use in mathematics, set theory, let's say. The question of whether it isn't that set theory is a thing that is forced on us by the way the world is. Set theory is a choice that we make. We choose to think about, the axiom of choice or something like this. It is a thing where we're kind of constructing this thing that is sort of is kind of it's a reflection of our mind that we choose to do things in this particular way. It's not something that's forced on us by some sort of feature of the world, so to speak. So it's a thing that is created by us. It's the thing created by us because it's sort of our way of expressing things. I think also that the choice of what mathematics one does, what axiom systems, what direction one goes, is something which, in the practice of mathematics, I know a whole bunch of people here are practicing mathematicians. I think it would be fair to say that an awful lot of the preference about what to do is in many ways an aesthetic preference. It's not a preference that's led by sort of what is necessarily out there. It's led by what one chooses to sort of to put together. There's more to say about this, but
Thank you for that. Let's. Can you join me?
We have a little present.
Oh.
If you have a look inside,
oh my gosh,
you can explain why
yes. Well,
we
yes.
have bought you cheap chocolate.
Yeah. I do not think of myself as a flake, but this happens to be my favorite form of chocolate. It must have been imprinted on me at an early age growing up in this country. But thank you. That's very practical.
Stephen Wolfram, thank you.